YouTube, how you doing? Murph here, bringing you another product review. Today's review is going to be on the Razer Wolverine V2 Chroma. This is a newer controller put out by Razer, and it's truly one of the more unique controllers that have come onto the market recently. It's got some really cool features, and we'll go over the features and specifications in a moment, but as usual, we'll start off by talking about the design and the build quality. One of the first things you'll notice here is that it does have RGB diffusers going down the grips of the controller. And it does look quite good. It's very bright and it is customizable in their software. As far as the size of this controller, it's about 6.35 inches long, about 4.16 inches wide, and it's about 2.5 inches tall. And this controller weighs right around 0.6 pounds, which is about 270 grams. You can see that this is a pretty standard Xbox controller layout with a few exceptions, one of which is that the menu and view buttons have been moved kind of in a diagonal orientation to the top here rather than right in the center. And one of the other major changes is that this controller is actually slightly elongated. And what that does is that actually extends out where the joysticks would normally be for a typical controller. It definitely provides a little bit of a different feeling compared to a standard Xbox controller. I'm still unsure if I like that or not. It was a little bit jarring at first. I have gotten a little bit more used to it and it's kind of growing on me, but just be aware that when you first hold this controller, it will feel a little bit different. And part of that is because these joysticks are a little bit further away from each other, and just the overall shape of the controller is a little bit more broad than you're normally used to. It does feature 2-position trigger stops, so you've got the traditional full trigger pull here, and then kind of a shorter, what I would say was probably about half trigger pull once those locks are engaged. Another design feature are the paddles on the back. Just as with other aftermarket controllers these days, they do feature 4 paddles on the back. The design is a lot different here though than what you would normally find. Typically those back paddles are going to be more off to the side where your fingers kind of naturally rest right there. And on this, it's much more towards the middle of the controller. And honestly, I'm not really a fan. They can be quite hard to reach back here. You almost have to make a concerted effort to really stretch your fingers along the back of the controller to hit those 2 buttons. And when you're using those buttons a lot, what you're doing when you have to extend your fingers all the way out here is you're loosening the grip on the actual grips of the controller. So I find that when you're constantly hitting those, what would traditionally be mapped as the A and B buttons back there, you've really only got these 2 fingers right here wrapped around the grip of the controller. And that kind of messes with my grip a little bit, and it's also just kind of an uncomfortable, awkward angle to reach those middle paddles. Obviously, I can't speak for everyone. There might be some people out there that disagree and find that really comfortable, but for me, the placement of these back paddles just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense at all. Finishing up with the design of this controller are the bumpers up top. This is definitely one of the more unique features of this controller. It's not something you typically see on an aftermarket controller, are the 2 extra buttons up top. So in addition to the 4 paddles on the back, you also have 2 additional bumpers, and these can be mapped to anything that you wish using their software. Unlike the poor placement of the paddles on the back, the placement of these bumpers up top is actually pretty good. They're easy to reach, and they've got a nice satisfying click to them. I don't know what I would map these to. I would need to play a little bit more with this controller to see what would be good to map up there, because unlike the paddles in the back that you can press while you're using the bumpers and the triggers, these extra bumpers up top you can't really press while hitting the bumpers and the triggers up top. So I'm not sure what I would map those to, but the placement is solid on those. Now talking about the build quality is probably the star of the show with this controller. The build quality is very, very good. It's got a nice little bit of heft to it. It's not as heavy as an Elite Series 2, but I would say it's probably very similar to what we saw with the Scuff Instinct Pro. It's not overly heavy, but you do feel like it's a quality product that you're holding on to. My favorite feature of this whole controller is what Razer has marketed as their Mecha Tactile Action buttons. And what they've done is they've tried to replicate the tech found in gaming mice that kind of deliver the really fast actuation and the tactile clicks of a mouse. And they've implemented that into their controller. And all of the buttons on this controller feel fantastic. X, Y, A, and B are very satisfying to click, and I'm sure you can hear that. Most of the buttons on this controller are a little bit louder than you would typically find in a standard Xbox controller. And it's really hard to describe how they feel other than the fact that they do almost kind of mimic the click of a mouse button. So you'll kind of just have to take my word for it that these might be the best buttons that I've ever felt on a controller. And it doesn't stop with the X, Y, A, and B buttons. The D-pad also features the same mecha tactile action buttons. The triggers feel great on this controller, as do all of the bumpers. Very tactile feeling as well. And while I'm really not a fan of the placement of the back buttons at all, I will say that they also have a nice satisfying click to them. Everything about the build quality of this controller is just really good. Now, as far as the specifications for this controller, it is a wired only controller. So if you're looking for wireless functionality, this is not going to be the way to go. We've already kind of touched on the mecha tactile action buttons that they have on this controller. One of the other specifications of this controller is it features something that they call sensitivity clutch for the thumbsticks. This is something that can be adjusted in the software, and we'll go ahead and talk about the software right now. Alright, so their software is available for both the Xbox console as well as PC, and once you download their Razer controller software, this is what you'll be presented with. You'll see your device in the top left, and you can also create additional profiles so that you can save, I believe it's up to 5 different profiles with this controller, and you can edit the specific profile, and you can see here are all of the functions that you can do with this controller. Assign buttons, this is where you're going to go to adjust the mapping for those top 2 additional bumpers as well as the back paddles. Thumbstick sensitivity, this is where you're going to get into that sensitivity clutch feature that I was referring to earlier. You can see up here you can adjust the actual sensitivity of this feature, and you can do so independently for each thumbstick. And just to give you kind of an idea of what this does, you can hold a multifunction key. In this case, it's mapped to M5, which is on the back. And you can see here in this little window on the left, when I'm moving the joystick, I have kind of a full range of motion. But when I hold down that multifunction key, again, in this case, it's mapped to M5, but you can map it to anything that you want. Once I hold that down, my range of motion is now significantly smaller, and you can adjust the sensitivity of this individually. So if you want this a little bit more or less aggressive, you can do that here in the software. And this basically allows you to kind of have a little bit of a sensitivity adjustment on the fly. So let's say if you're normally moving around and you're using the right thumbstick, it would operate as normal. But now let's say I'm zoomed in on a sniper scope and I want to decrease the sensitivity to make my aiming a little bit more accurate. I can hold down M6 and now I have a little bit of lower sensitivity, and my rifle scope now is not going to be flying all over the place. This isn't a feature I think I would use, but it is cool that they included that here. This kind of gives you a little bit of an option to do something different. You can adjust the vibration amount here. You can see what a level 10 is for this controller. Very good vibration motors in this controller, and you can adjust those here or even turn them off completely if you would like. And of course, the lighting adjustments, you can turn up or down the brightness, and it's got a few different LED functions here. So overall, would I recommend this controller? It's really kind of a tough call for me because on the one hand, when you take into account how good the buttons feel on this controller and the overall build quality, the design, the RGB lighting, just kind of the whole package of this controller, this is honestly one of the best controllers I've reviewed in a while. And so I kind of want to recommend this controller. However, it's also got some big drawbacks. The first being, for $150, you're not getting any kind of wireless functionality with this controller, and I think that's a big miss. That's a pretty steep price for a wired only controller. The second issue I have with this controller, and this is really the main issue that I have, is that one of the biggest reasons you buy an aftermarket controller these days are for the additional back paddles. These are really kind of a game changer, especially if you play any kind of shooter. These are almost a necessity nowadays to play at any kind of competitive level at all. So this is really one of the main features of the controller, and I just can't get past the placement of these paddles, especially since this controller is a little bit wider than most already as it is. You really have to stretch out your fingers in the back to even hit those buttons. It might be something that you can get used to with time, but it's very awkward. And so that's gonna play a big role in whether or not I would recommend this controller as well. This controller is definitely solid, and in this price range you're competing with things like the Scuff Instinct Pro, the Scuff Prestige, the Elite Series 2, all of which have pretty good build quality. I think if you give this controller a chance and you buy it, you probably won't regret it. It's extremely well made. It comes with a software option very similar to the Elite Series 2, where you can go into the software, make any adjustments that you need. It's really easy to remap those back paddles. But overall, would I recommend buying this controller? I think since you're in this $150 price range, probably not. If you don't think you'd have a problem with the back button placement and you don't need the wireless functionality, I think this is a fantastic controller. But as great as the buttons feel, as good as the build quality is, because it's wired only and it doesn't give you any of that flexibility if you want to use this wirelessly, mixed with the fact that I'm not a big fan of the back paddle placement, I think that's enough for me to probably not recommend this over, say, a Scuff Instinct Pro or an Elite Series 2. And that wraps up the review, guys. If you found this video useful or helpful at all, make sure to hit the thumbs up button. If you would like to see other content like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be notified of when I post new content. And YouTube, we'll catch you later.